And today I'm going to talk to you about two very huge topics, both of which are here on the PowerPoint slide, the US Constitution and the American Enlightenment, that we often think of as belonging naturally together, and to show that actually one of them is a complete fabrication. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to argue that the US Constitution is a complete fabrication, so everyone can relax, especially Paul and Kevin. What I'm going to argue is that this moment in national history called the American Enlightenment is in fact the invention of the post-World War II era. So is the idea that the so-called American Enlightenment is the spectacular culmination of Enlightenment ideas that were born in Europe. And third, so is the idea that the Constitution is at the very middle of this so-called American Enlightenment. These three things, it turns out, are all myths invented in the decades after World War II, which today I'm going to tear down for you and to reconstruct so that we have a correct sense of what Enlightenment in America was in the 18th century and how the United States Constitution fits in with it. So let's back up a little and begin at the beginning. When we think of something called the American Enlightenment, and I hope you appreciate that I fiddled around with the PowerPoint and made the American Enlightenment glow there, so it's glowing. When we think of something glowing called the American Enlightenment, we almost always think of things related to the American Revolution, usually the 8-year military struggle against Great Britain, or the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers, and then the Constitution itself as the culmination of all of these events. And in fact, if you Google the term, the American Enlightenment, don't do this right now though, right? Do it later. If you Google the term, the American Enlightenment, and as we know, Googling terms is the gold standard for all knowledge today. These are exactly the images that appear. So this is actually the first image that comes up if you Google the American Enlightenment. You get John Trumbull's The Surrender of Lord Cornwallis, which you know that the surrender was not itself in 1820. The surrender was much earlier. The painting was done in 1820. But this is one of the images you get. You also get this one, another John Trumbull painting of the Declaration of Independence, also not done in 1817. The painting was completed in 1817. And then you also get this very famous portrait of Benjamin Franklin from 1785, done just as he was leaving France after his service there. All right, well, what could possibly be wrong with this picture of the American Enlightenment? Well, nothing, as long as we recognize that the idea of a big, bold, glowing American Enlightenment was actually invented out of whole cloth in the years immediately following World War II, amid rising American anxieties about the Soviet Union. In the midst of the many terrifying isms of the 20th century and all of those things that the isms had inflicted upon Europe, Marxism, communism, totalitarianism, and fascism, Americans of the World War II era created a new mythical moment in their national past that they christened the American Enlightenment. It's easy to spot the making of this new national mythology. National magazines during the Cold War published apocalyptic visions of Soviet attacks on the United States. Here is a 1951 painting from Collier's magazine of the bombing of Washington, D.C., where the Soviets have strategically destroyed what the author of the magazine called the shrines of American freedom, which were, of course, the monuments of the American Revolution. The author envisioned the Jefferson Memorial being blown to smithereens and the top of the Washington Monument being sheared off. So those of you who are experts on the city of Washington, D.C. can try to figure out where those things are. It was amid these nightmarish scenarios that the so-called American Enlightenment took root in the American imagination. Like a Cold War bomb shelter made of ideas instead of concrete, Americans crafted a mythological era of freedom and democracy in the 18th century that they called the American Enlightenment. And you can see the rise of this new term in the immediate post-war era. I plugged it into the other determiner of what we know today, not just Google, but something called Ngram. You can go to Ngram and plug in any word, and it'll show you how it increases in usage over time. So this is the term, the American Enlightenment, plugged into Ngram. There's absolutely no usage of the term before the 1940s, certainly not in the 18th century, and we can see the rising usage of this term over time, and finally its stabilization. So who is responsible for the wholesale fabrication of an entire historical era that did not exist before? Well, a lot of people in the post-World War II era helped to fabricate this new idea, but the earliest major proponent was the historian Adrienne Koch, who is so forgotten today, even though she wrote 20 books. So depressing for someone who's only written 3 books, that you can be forgotten after 20. She's so obscure today, even though she wrote 20 books, that I couldn't even find a picture of her to show you. But here is the image of the cover of her 1965 book, The American Enlightenment. This is the first book in the history of the world to have the title, The American Enlightenment, and it has the celebratory subtitle about the role of the American Enlightenment in the shaping of what she calls a free society, very much a Cold War term. Koch singled out what she called the Big Five founders, this is her term, the Big Five founders, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, for embodying what she called the vision and the spirit that underlay the free society and democratic civilization of modern America. In Adrienne Koch's view, and this is key for us today, the political drama of the American Revolution formed the very center of this new mythical era that she was calling the American Enlightenment. And she argued publicly that Enlightenment ideals remained of the highest relevance in the mid-20th century. We should appreciate our American Enlightenment, she seemed to say, the way we appreciate vaccines and other modern wonders that protect us from very bad things like viruses and communists. By the mid-70s, and especially during the American bicentennial, these ideas had become embellished and amplified. In 1976 and 1977, the years of the American Enlightenment, of the bicentennial, no less than 3 books were published that confidently assured us that there had been an American Enlightenment, and moreover, that this American Enlightenment was most clearly embodied. In fact, it was realized during the political struggles of the American Revolution. These books set into stone a second crucial myth of the mid-20th century idea of the American Enlightenment, that its ideas had been born in Europe, especially in France, in the minds of airy philosophers like Voltaire, and had then migrated, like so many immigrants, to the United States, where the airy ideas had been forged into real hard facts during the American Revolution. As the historian Henry Steele Commager put it in his 1977 book, The Empire of Reason, which is the one over there on the right, the old world imagined, invented, and formulated the Enlightenment. The new world realized it and fulfilled it. I call this the myth of diffusionism, that the ideas of the American Enlightenment were born in Europe and then came to America, like a one-way boat ticket, no return passage. But as this map of Benjamin Franklin's lifetime correspondence network shows, Franklin's is the blue one on the top, Voltaire's is the orange one on the bottom. Ideas in the 18th century didn't just cross the Atlantic once on a westward bound ship. They crossed it multiple times, back and forth. The orange map below Franklin's map of Voltaire's correspondence network also shows that it's entirely possible for a major European figure of the 18th century to not have any New World correspondence, except one. Those of you who can see the orange line, there's one, and we can talk about who that is in the Q&A. By the way, these images are from Stanford's Mapping the Republic of Letters project that I work on among my other side projects is to map the correspondence network of Ben Franklin, so I'm happy to answer any questions about this if you have them as well. Not only does Ben Franklin's lifetime correspondence network show that ideas constantly crisscross the Atlantic in the 18th century, but glimpses of the development of his network over time show that ideas crisscross back and forth more intensely as time went on. Here's a time lapse of his correspondence network. This is in 1758, the second year after he arrives in London for an 18-year journey there. And I know that you're all looking at those mystery letters that appear to be going to Kansas City when there was no Kansas City in the 18th century. Maybe they're going to Norman, Oklahoma, I don't know, but there's some that look like they're going to the middle of the country. They're not. This is where the computer puts anything for which we don't have location data. So those are our unknowns. So don't think that Ben Franklin had correspondence in Kansas City. He didn't. Okay, so if that's on the test, the answer is no, he didn't have correspondence there. So that's 1758. This is 1775 when he left London before going to Paris. So you can see, look again, 1758, 1775. Ideas are crossing more intensively over time. So the takeaway is that Europeans and Americans were in constant conversation over centuries of time, exchanging ideas that were enlightened more and more intensively as the years went by. It's not just a one-time trip to the West for European ideas into the Americas, and it's not just happening at the moment of the American Revolution. So why should we care about all of these things that happened half a century ago? Well, we should care because as a result of the work of these mid-20th century historians and artists and politicians, we all assume today that there was a thing called the American Enlightenment, and that the American Revolutionary Era was the brilliant sun of 18th century American intellectual and political history, pulling everything into its orbit, including all the ideas about freedom and democracy that we really like today. The mythical American Enlightenment gives a satisfying, triumphal narrative trajectory to the history of ideas in America, soothing our fears that compared to Europe, we might be a little lacking in the big idea department. Europeans might have Newton, Voltaire, Kant, and Spinoza, but Americans have the American Enlightenment, whose most important outcome, as I'll talk about later, is the federal Constitution, which remains so relevant to so many of our modern concerns and needs. This narrative of the American Enlightenment is so different from Europeans' ideas of their own Enlightenment. After the calamities of World War II, Europeans looked back on the Enlightenment with guilt and anxiety. They stared at their ruined continent and asked, how did we get here from there? The loudest hand-wringers were two German expatriate scholars, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. That's Horkheimer on the left, Adorno on the right. And for those of you who are Jürgen Habermas groupies, he's the young guy on the far right. They had fled Nazi Germany for America, and their searing indictment of modernity, the 1944 Manifesto Dialectic of Enlightenment, drew a straight line from the 18th century Enlightenment and its rationalism and scientism to the modern cancers of materialism and excessive systematizing that seemed to have brought things like the toxic racial categories of the Nazis. Since that World War II moment, Europeans have what I call a combative or oppositional relationship with their Enlightenment. This oppositional Enlightenment nurtures a flourishing industry of bracing reinterpretations that are often as critical of the present as they are of the past. For Europeans, their Enlightenment is like the bathroom scale. It tells them what they need to know about present conditions, but not always what they want to hear. By contrast with this oppositional European Enlightenment, the American Enlightenment is foundational to Americans' sense today that we are a people of progress. Foundational arguments presume a solid base on which to ground their conclusions, and Americans have chosen to ground their Enlightenment, the American Enlightenment, in the patriotic pride of the founding moment of the Republic in 1776. Americans are like the 18th century French physiocrat Dupont de Nemours, writing to his old friend Thomas Jefferson in 1816. "My friend," wrote Nemours, "we are snails, and we have a mountain range to climb. By God, we must climb it." This is not a drawing from the 18th century, by the way. This is what happens when you Google snails climbing mountains. I wanted to show you a picture. All right, so who cares about all of this? Well, what has been lost in this big, grand 20th century construction called the American Enlightenment is the actual reality of the 18th century. I have a new book out this month. Thank you, Kevin, for drawing it to our attention. And actually, I've been told that there's books in the warehouse as of tomorrow. So you can order it tomorrow, should you be so inclined. What has been lost in this big, grand 20th century construction is the reality of the 18th century. In the new book that I have out this month, I attempt to rescue the 18th century ideas of enlightenment from our own 20th century, modern, highly politicized 20th century version of the American Enlightenment. The book shows that the 20th century term obscures more than it reveals, holding the 18th century to our own highly politicized and nationalistic standards of what enlightenment is or was, rather than listening to people in the 18th century themselves. They never used the term the American Enlightenment, but they did very frequently talk about their quest for a very elusive and unstable state of being that they called enlightenment, with a small e. What did they mean by this term? Well, they basically meant two things. First, that human reason, rather than superstition or biblical revelation, would help us to understand the world. And second, that instead of getting worse, as the Bible narrative of the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden had said, that human societies were in fact constantly getting better. In short, these 18th century people were the first people in the history of the world to believe that human reason would lead to progress. But here's the key. They didn't think that enlightenment had ever been achieved. It was a constant process, onward, upward, but never ending and hardly ever achieved. So in short, where we see an era, an admirable thing that is already done, the actual people who lived in the 18th century saw a process, never completed because human reason was always fallible. They were never sure exactly whether enlightenment had been achieved. There was always room for improvement. They were the most hopeful and optimistic people in the history of the world, but they were also highly uncertain and questioning about their own abilities to achieve perfection. We can glimpse some of their uncertainty and questioning by looking at some of the visual imagery that they pioneered to try to make sense of their world. especially for people in the Americas who were constantly faced with trying to understand a radically new place. This is the imagery of organization and clarification and attempting to answer the many questions that they and Europeans had about their world. So I want to, instead of that art that I showed you at the beginning of patriotism, this is the art of the American Enlightenment. These are tables. They love tables and charts. This is from Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. This is one of the first tables in American history to feature counts of the American Indians. They had to be counted or not counted, as the Constitution had it, for the new Republican schemes of representation. And so this is not only Jefferson trying to count the numbers of different tribes, but he's showing you his sources, 4 different texts from which he's getting his Indian counts. So this is a kind of art. It is the art of illumination and clarification about some of the major issues of republicanism. And this is the first pie chart in American history. I'll bet you never thought about the history of pie charts. Well, now this is the first pie chart. This is a representation of the United States based on how large in miles the states are. So you can see that the project for the 19th century is the big green thing. This is Louisiana down here at the bottom, the place that still needs counting. Other art of enlightenment is the art of understanding what is around us in the world. This is John Winthrop, not the John Winthrop, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is John Winthrop, his descendant, the chief astronomer at Harvard, who is the most important astronomer in 18th century America. This is him looking at the most important astronomical event of the 18th century, which is the transit of Venus over the face of the sun. He has his London-made telescope, and you can see his hand is hovering over an image of the transit that he is making. So with his hand, he's drawing celestial movements to clarify, to reveal. Here is the companion portrait of his wife, who was not an astronomer, but look what she's doing with her hands. She's using fruit, which is the conventional artistic representation of what you show with women to show fecundity, but she's using them to show the movement of astronomical objects in space. She's literally showing you how planets orbit. You can see this most clearly when I put them together. A lot of husbands and wives had their portraits painted together. And you can see that this is the imagery of scientific investigation as it was revealed in the 18th century. So the art of the American Enlightenment is not the art of the formal portrait of the revolutionaries that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. It is the art of clarification and question asking, of illumination and reflection. Enlightened people, and this is the takeaway, were far less triumphal than they were inquisitive, anxious, and unsure. Okay, let me spend the rest of the lecture diving into a concrete example of what it meant to be enlightened in the 18th century by looking at the US Constitution and where it fits into enlightenment in America. Critical to the invention of the 20th century idea of the American Enlightenment was the US Constitution as the crowning achievement of that invented era, a document that embodied the rightness and the certainty of the American Republican project. It's fun to see how this happened in visual imagery as much as in written texts of the 20th century. And no artist contributed more to the 20th century's crowning of the US Constitution than Howard Chandler Christie, the artist who had already achieved national fame during World War I for updating the famous Gibson girls into the Christie girls who adorned patriotic posters everywhere. Howard Chandler Christie is partly responsible for the achievement in 1940 of the apotheosis of the hyper-real, enlightened US Constitution, as you can see in this painting that he made in 1940. Now, it helps to know by way of background that no paintings of the Constitutional Convention were made at the actual moment of the signing, or even for many decades after. And just so you have grounds for comparison of this painting from 1940, this is the first painting, the first visual image ever made of the US Constitution. It was made in the decade immediately prior to the Civil War by Junius Brutus Stearns in 1856. So you can see that there's a big difference. There's the dull wood plank floor, the plain clothes, the drawn curtains. It looks very gloomy, almost like we're in a funeral parlor. It's all very roughshod and dark. The main character is George Washington, and if you look closely, he looks like he has cross eyes, though we won't dwell on that, and he also gets covered shoes. Everybody else gets slippers. Okay, so so now you have a comparison for what we get to with this. We can see how the whole thing just gets bigger and grander over the next century as the need in the United States in the face of Soviet threats for certainty about the Constitution and an era of commitment to freedom and democracy increased. Howard Chandler Christie was commissioned to make this painting after one politician noticed that no picture of the Constitutional Convention hung in the US Capitol building. Enter Christie. The painting is ordered to be heroic in size. It's 20 feet by 30 feet, so this is actually kind of life-size right here up on the stage. And it was the most expensive painting ever commissioned by the federal government to date and took 3 years to research and complete. Highly relevant to our story about the modern invention of a hyper-real era of political certainty called the American Enlightenment, American government officials repeatedly claimed that this 1940 painting was the most accurate, these are their words, accurate, authentic, and truest rendition of the signing because Christie had consulted portraits of the founders. This is an artist who does research, and had even borrowed books from Jefferson's library to place under Ben Franklin's chair. You can see them there. At its unveiling in 1940, President Roosevelt himself declared that the painting was a democratic antidote to the diabolical forces on the rise in Europe. As abstract modern art became ever more popular, Howard Christie produced a painting deliberately designed to be non-abstract and instead hyper-realistic and authentic. But the painting was anything but authentic. Christie was a master of icons like the Christie girl, and he later became famous for this portrait of Jesus Christ as an icon. In his painting of the Constitutional Convention, he has elevated the document to the status of Enlightenment icon, hyper-real and, according to his supporters, hyper-accurate. He visited the actual room in Philadelphia where the Constitutional Convention had been held in 1787, and then set to work reimagining it for use as the modern antidote to the dark totalitarian menace. All the curtains are now pulled open, bathing the room in brilliant white light, which becomes so dazzling on the right-hand side that the wall behind George Washington fairly dissolves into a blur of brilliance, as though it stood for the whole concept of the American Enlightenment. The delegates, including the weirdly saluting ones to the left, do you see those? Those are the Pinckneys from South Carolina, because the painting also comes with a key, a numbered key, you know, like paint by numbers, so you can figure out who they are. So those are the Pinckneys who are saluting. The delegates are spectacularly overdressed in powdered wigs and gleaming golden outfits, as though they were French aristocrats airlifted from Versailles in the era of Louis XIV, the Sun King. The 20th century's favorite founders are conveniently seated in plain view. Ben Franklin stares directly at the viewer. From the back of his chair, an enormous train of blue fabric unfolds regally over Jefferson's books. Franklin's clothing and face, and even his expression, are recognizable as a clone of the 1785 painting I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, as though he'd changed neither his outfit nor his expression in about 200 years. Also like a clone of Gilbert Stuart's portrait from the late 1790s, George Washington stands proudly erect in front of the chair with its image of the rising sun. By now, Ben Franklin's apocryphal quotation about the chair was widely known, one of the most often quoted pieces of lore about the US Constitutional Convention, though we actually don't really know if he said it. It's just neat if he did say it. I have often looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting, Franklin allegedly said. But now I know that it is a rising sun. Everywhere, the imagery of illumination and enlightenment and frozen certainty prevails. So this is what the World War II generation thought about the light and brilliance and certainty of the US Constitution. It was part of a larger mid-20th century invention of a hyper-real, hyper-patriotic American Enlightenment that would shield America from totalitarian threats abroad. Much more elusive is what people in the 18th century actually said was enlightened about the US Constitution. Scraping away the 20th century barnacles, as I do in chapter 8 of my book on the Enlightenment, reveals a much more tenuous picture than the painting of Howard Chandler Christie. It turns out that Americans in the 18th century weren't exactly sure what was enlightened about the Constitution or even the revolution that had preceded it. So this is the first major takeaway from the revolutionary American view of enlightenment, that they were never sure at all whether their Republican revolution and its rituals and practices and structures were bringing them closer to enlightenment or further away from it. We should remember Franklin's uncertainty at the Constitutional Convention about whether the sun depicted on the back of George Washington's chair was rising or setting. Today we presume that he must have been joking and that he was in fact sure that the sun was rising. But let's place ourselves back in the 18th century for a few minutes and remember some realities. The first reality was that monarchies were widely regarded by many people in the 18th century as agents of enlightenment. We presume today, as Americans, that all monarchs are devious fossil relics of a benighted past. But it was in fact the case that for centuries, monarchs had been agents of enlightenment in Europe. The active, aggressive bureaucracies of 18th century European monarchs had helped to push back the power of the Catholic Church, and admiring references to the idea of the philosopher king as the road to people's happiness appeared in some of the most widely disseminated texts of the 18th century. No other bureaucratic structure in 17th and 18th century Europe had equivalent financial resources to support a thriving cultural and intellectual life. And between 1500 and 1800, many European monarchs had embarked on the project of making their courts the monumental expressions of monarchical political policy and cultural patronage that they called Enlightenment. In the American colonies themselves, King George II, whose 33-year reign was actually the longest of any colonial American monarch, but we always forget about poor George II because of the guy who came after, George III. He oversaw the founding of 3 colleges in America, including Princeton, and his portrait hung in Nassau Hall and did until it was burned to ashes during the American Revolution. Note the enormous train of blue fabric unfolding behind him, which we also saw in the portrait of Ben Franklin. So Americans still like to conjure monarchical imagery, even though we disavow monarchy. A deep interest in intellectual and cultural patronage extended to the wife of George III, Queen Caroline. She was widely revered by the American colonists as a great patroness of science and education. Fair Princess Thou was the beginning of a poem written in the 1720s at her coronation by one of her many admiring American colonists in Boston, the later seat of the American Revolutionary Uprising. This medal shows a gigantic Queen Caroline watering a grove of tiny Carolina palms with the logo, "Growing Arts Adorn Empire, Caroline, protecting. She was seen as the most active agent of Enlightenment in 18th century America. Even after the American Revolution that disavowed monarchy, Americans continued to appeal to royal patronage for their intellectual projects. Returning to the United States after his diplomatic service in France, John Adams founded the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1780, in explicit acknowledgement of the role that monarchies and aristocracies played in nurturing European cultural and intellectual life. In brief, in nurturing European Enlightenment. So in January of 1776, when Thomas Paine began very strenuously to paint monarchy as backward and irrelevant in his widely circulated pamphlet Common Sense, British writers rose up in opposition to declare what everyone in Europe knew to be true, that monarchs were agents of enlightenment, and that it was republicanism that was strange, untried, and potentially unenlightening. Hereditary monarchs, these writers declared, could have no interests opposed to those of their people. If anyone could pursue happiness, it was people led by a monarch. These British writers had a very good point. Though Thomas Paine mocked George III as the royal brute of Britain, in fact, this particular king ranked among the most educated and cultured monarchs ever to sit on the British throne. The king's education far exceeded in depth and breadth that of many British university graduates at the time, and it certainly far surpassed that possessed by the military man George Washington, who had never attended college and knew no foreign languages. By contrast, the future George III's education had become an urgent national priority the moment his father died and he abruptly moved to the front of the order of royal succession. And here is a gigantic portrait of George III's wife, Queen Charlotte, posing with her two eldest sons. I know they look like daughters, but they're dressed like 18th century royal sons, that is, in dresses. She has on the piano behind her, underneath the sewing box. That book is the premier enlightened child-rearing manual of the 18th century, John Locke's Thoughts on Education. Resting there for all to see. For the record, this was exactly the same book that Abigail Adams used to raise her 4 children in the precepts of enlightened Republican citizenship. Both of those mothers sent their eldest sons to the highest office in the land. Queen Charlotte sent George IV, of course, to be the next King of England, and Abigail Adams sent John Quincy Adams to become the President of the United States. So what's the takeaway here? Well, the takeaway is that the kingless republic that Americans created in their Constitution in 1787, one that granted as much or more real power to the president than that held by the British monarch, was by no means universally thought of as being the most enlightened of documents, even by Americans. Nor were newly independent Americans sure at all that Republican government was the government best suited for creating an enlightened people, given how much monarchies and aristocracies had done over the last 300 years to promote learning among their citizens through universities, symphonies, museums, and scientific societies. Americans had no national university. They still don't. And patronage for the arts and sciences remained a source of constant anxiety in the absence of a landed gentry and kings, just as it does today. And in fact, some of the Constitution's major architects were deeply uncertain that the words in it were clear at all. In Federalist Paper number 37, one of the essays written in support of the Constitution immediately after its drafting, James Madison unrolled a remarkable series of doubts about the ability of language itself to convey meaning clearly. Madison was heavily influenced by the linguistic theories of John Locke, the one whose book we saw on Queen Charlotte's piano. Locke believed that all language was created by human beings on the fly, rather than being given to us by God with single meanings attached to an external reality. Language, thought Locke, was shifty. A single word could mean many things to many different people. Speaking of the US Constitution, Madison openly worried about what he called the inaccuracy of the terms we commonly use to communicate with one another. His colleague Oliver Ellsworth, the delegate from Connecticut, chimed in to agree. This is Ellsworth. The charge of being ambiguous and indefinite may be brought against every human composition, and necessarily arises from the imperfection of language, wrote Ellsworth, while nonetheless strongly supporting ratification. Ellsworth went on, perhaps no two men will express the same sentiment in the same manner, and by the same words. Neither do they connect precisely the same ideas with the same words. So here we have two of the loudest champions of the Constitution calling its language and all language inaccurate, ambiguous, cloudy, and indefinite. Yet here is a portrait of Oliver Ellsworth, one of the few paintings in the 18th century actually to depict someone with the US Constitution. We're very far from the gleaming windows, Christ-like motifs, and glittering jackets of Christie's images from the late 1930s and 1940s. We're now on a quiet farm on a gloomy day in rural Connecticut in 1792, where the US Constitution is part of a domestic scene. We have a husband, a wife, and between them, a baby constitution. 18th century artists loved to depict their subjects with documents and books of various kinds, but usually they are unidentifiable as specific texts. And the basic idea of documentness is all that is required to show off the sitter's vast learning. But here the artist has taken pains to show us that this is the US Constitution. You can actually read it. It's extraordinary. Here's a close-up, and I thank the Connecticut gallery that holds this painting for sending me this close-up. Here's the close-up, and at the bottom you can actually make out the words Article 7. The word article is misspelled. You see that it's got two L's. I think it's because when you write something very slowly, you often misspell it. That's why you can Google yard sard. And see all the people who tried to write yard sale signs, but they were writing yard sale so slowly that they just wrote yard sard. So I think this is what happened to the artist here, is he wrote article very slowly, and so it's misspelled. So you can read all of Article 7. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. Interestingly, this version of the Constitution doesn't include the signatures, which exactly replicates the situation that Ellsworth found himself in because he ended up leaving the convention before he could sign the document. So in a sense, Ellsworth is taking ownership of the document in this painting since his name doesn't appear on the original. And in case you're wondering, that's not Article 6 above Article 7. You would think it is, but it's not, and I don't know what it is. So I am happy to send this to anybody out there so you can tell me. I have passed it along to my colleagues at Stanford who are experts on the US Constitution saying, what does that stuff above Article 7 say? And nobody can figure it out. This is an example of ambiguity in the 18th century. All right, so what else is interesting here? Something that can tell us more about the tenuous, uncertain nature of knowledge in the 18th century, which fascinated people who called themselves enlightened. Well, look out the window into the landscape. The house that the Ellsworths are sitting in is also visible behind them, big and white with a red roof. They had by now earned enough money to add on to their old house and wanted everyone to see how big it actually was, but also how pretty the inside was with the fashionable carpet and the rows of books that marked Oliver Ellsworth as one of the men with the largest private libraries in Connecticut. So let's just pause here and ponder the sheer weirdness of what the artist and Ellsworth are asking that we accept. This is actually a big house in the background, but it looks small because it's in the distance, being seen through the window of a room that, while appearing to be bigger than the house it's supposed to fit into, is in fact smaller than the house it fits into. Here are indeed some pyrotechnics asking us to play with our self-evident truths about perspective, size, and representation, all matters that preoccupied not just 18th century artists, but 18th century political theorists. Confused? Who wouldn't be? But the fascinations of representation and ambiguity were everywhere for people who called themselves enlightened in 18th century America. It will not surprise you to learn that Oliver Ellsworth was the delegate to Philadelphia who helped to broker the Great Compromise, which ended the struggle between large and small states over representation by assigning 2 senators to each state, regardless of population. How the small would become big and the big become small. By 1792, when this painting was completed, Ellsworth was representing tiny Connecticut in this grandiose manner as its first U.S. senator in a political house that made tiny states such as Connecticut seem as big as giants like Virginia. To people like Oliver Ellsworth, political representation and artistic representation faced similar challenges. All this from a framer devoted to the document that he holds in his hands, or hand, as the case may be. This very odd painting featuring Oliver Ellsworth suggests that enlightened Americans were not so much certain about what their eyes told them as willing to ask questions about what their eyes and, in fact, all of their 5 senses told them. Those who thought themselves enlightened liked to heed their 5 senses to help them to know what was really true. They thought that this empirical knowledge would release them from the prison of biblical revelation, superstition, miracles, from the reign of what they called priestcraft, by which they meant the Catholic Church, and from what Jefferson called abracadabra. But listen again to James Madison in Federalist 37. Our senses routinely deceive us. They are nothing but imperfection. We should lower our expectations and hopes from the efforts of human sagacity. This was Madison's initial summing up of the words of the U.S. Constitution. Words were muddy, meaning was unclear. No wonder that in 1796, less than 10 years after ratification, the U.S. House of Representatives spent not 1 day, but 2 whole days debating this incredible question. Was it okay to declare to all the world in a formal statement that the United States, and I quote, was the most enlightened nation in the world? They spent 2 days debating that question. Are we the most enlightened nation in the world, and is it okay to say it to Europeans? Now, in retrospect, from where we stand, this sounds like the most ridiculously obscure and inconsequential topic to spend 2 days debating in the US House of Representatives. But off they went. They wondered if Republican government did, in fact, help the United States to become more enlightened than European monarchies, or whether Republican government merely helped to disperse learning of a shallow kind among a large variety of people, rather than cultivating the kind of special genius that truly enlightened statesmanship required. The question was eventually tabled. No one in the US House of Representatives in 1796 was sure enough about what it meant to be enlightened or how to measure the enlightenment of a people to declare the US to be the most enlightened nation in the world. So this, then, was enlightenment in America. There was not a single moment in American history in the 18th century called the American Enlightenment, one bathed in a heavenly glow of certainty. That was our invention in the 20th century, not the reality of the 18th century. If we listen carefully to the 18th century, to the people on those cloudy farms in Connecticut, we hear anxiety and doubt as much as hope and optimism. We see a process always ongoing, not a finished era varnished to a high gloss of certainty. The legacy of Enlightenment for Americans is not so much of providing definitive answers and being sure about everything, but of asking important questions about our world, about nature, society, and government. This legacy of questioning rather than declaring should be something that Americans both acknowledge and cherish. As the revolutionaries themselves have shown us today, doubt and questioning can be a real national strength. It makes people inquisitive, inventive, and open to new possibilities. And part of the adventure of living, of building societies and governments from scratch, is to talk together about what we don't know as much as about what we do know. It seems to me that this is a more useful version of Enlightenment for Americans today than a dusty mausoleum of self-evident truths. Thank you.